Tonight, you're going to do something that every single human on the planet does without thinking. You're going to get dressed. You'll grab a shirt, pull on pants, maybe stand in front of your closet for 30 seconds, feeling like you have absolutely nothing to wear despite owning 40 things. You'll pick something, put it on, and walk out the door without ever once stopping to ask yourself the most obvious question in the world. Why am I doing this? The answer seems obvious. To cover up, to stay warm, to follow the law, maybe to impress someone. But here's what nobody tells you. Every single one of those answers is either incomplete, misleading, or just flat out wrong. The real reason humans started wearing clothes is stranger than you think, more accidental, more deeply wired into what makes us human. And when you actually understand it, the way you think about getting dressed every morning will never be quite the same. Let's go back, way back. Homo sapiens, modern humans, have existed for roughly 300,000 years. That's the number scientists generally agree on. 300,000 years of us walking around on this planet. But the earliest solid archaeological evidence of clothing, that only goes back about 170,000 years. Do the math. That's a gap of 130,000 years where humans, fully modern, fully intelligent humans, walked around completely naked. Not occasionally naked, not naked when it was warm naked. Naked through migrations, naked through ice ages, naked across entire continents. And they were fine. So the moment someone tells you humans started wearing clothes because of the cold, you can push back. Because the timeline doesn't support it. If temperature was the primary driver, clothing would have appeared much earlier and much more consistently. But it didn't. Something else triggered it, and it took a study of lice to figure out what. In 2011, a team of researchers decided to approach this question from a completely unexpected angle. Instead of digging for ancient fabrics which decompose and almost never survive, they looked at something that does survive: genetics. Specifically, they studied the evolutionary split between two types of lice: head lice and body lice. Now, I know what you're thinking, but stay with me, because this is actually brilliant science. Body lice, the kind that live in clothing fibers, in the seams of shirts and the folds of fabric, did not exist before clothing. They couldn't. There was no habitat for them. They evolved directly from head lice * because * clothing created a new environment close to the human body that they could colonize. So by tracing exactly when that genetic split occurred using molecular clock analysis, which measures how fast DNA mutates over time, scientists could estimate when humans first began wearing clothes regularly enough for an entirely new parasite to evolve around it. The answer came back at roughly 170,000 years ago. And here's where it gets interesting, because 170,000 years ago, parts of southern Africa were going through a climate crisis. Temperatures dropped, rainfall patterns shifted, resources collapsed. Small human populations were pushed to coastal refuges along the southern tip of the continent, places like Pinnacle Point in what is now South Africa, where archaeologists have found evidence of shellfish consumption, ochre use, and some of the earliest signs of complex human behavior. These were people under pressure, real survival-level pressure. And clothing animal skins, most likely, was part of how they made it through. So, yes, in that specific moment, cold and survival played a role. But that's the beginning of the story, not the point of it. Because here's what happened almost immediately after. Once humans had clothing, once they had something covering their bodies, they started doing something that no other animal on the planet has ever done. They started decorating it. Not after centuries, not after millennia of practical use. Almost immediately, humans began adding color, pattern, and ornamentation to whatever they were wearing. Red and yellow ochre pigments pressed into animal hides. They were designing themselves. And this moment is what anthropologists consider one of the earliest and most significant cognitive leaps in human history. The shift from function to meaning, from covering to communicating. Dr. Francesco De Rico, an archaeologist at the University of Bordeaux who has spent decades studying early human ornamentation, describes this as evidence of asterisk symbolic thinking, asterisks the ability to assign meaning to objects beyond their physical purpose. To say, this isn't just animal skin. This is who I am. This is where I'm from. This is what group I belong to. Think about how radical that is. Before fully developed language, before writing, before money, before governments, religions, or any of the social systems we use to organize human life, there was clothing, and it was already doing the same job it does today. That outfit you chose this morning, it's sending signals about your profession, your taste, your social group, your mood, your aspirations, whether you care about what people think of you, or whether you've deliberately decided not to care, which is itself a signal. You are right now doing exactly what a human being 100,000 years ago did when they pressed red pigment into animal hide before walking into a gathering. The technology changed. The instinct never did. But there's another layer to this. One that goes even deeper. And this is the part that almost nobody talks about. There's a body of research developed over several decades and supported by scientists including Dr. Mark Stonking at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology that proposes something provocative. Clothing created a warm, protected microenvironment directly against the human body, a layer of space between skin and the outside world. And that layer, it turns out, requires maintenance, it gets dirty, it wears out, it needs to be replaced. It can harbor parasites, as the Lice Research shows, which means groups who managed their clothing well had better health outcomes than groups that didn't. Managing clothing required planning ahead. It required communication, explaining to others how to prepare hides, which plants produce durable fibers, how to construct coverings that wouldn't fall apart. It required cooperation, because making clothing from scratch is genuinely labor-intensive work that benefits from multiple people. And crucially, it required trade. Animal hides are heavy. Certain materials are only available in certain regions. Certain pigments, the ones used for decoration, come from specific geological deposits, moving those materials between groups, exchanging skills and resources, creating networks of supply and demand. Some researchers now argue that clothing production was one of the earliest drivers of economic exchange between human groups long before agriculture. Long before permanent settlements, the need to make, maintain, and decorate clothing created some of the first reasons for humans to cooperate with strangers. Groups that were better at this survived longer, traveled farther, adapted faster to new environments, and passed those cooperative instincts on to their children. In other words, the act of making clothes together may have been one of the foundational behaviors that trained the human brain for social complexity. Now here's where it gets genuinely strange, and I want you to sit with this for a second. Around 70,000 to 60,000 years ago, a small group of humans left Africa. We know this from genetic evidence. Every non-African person alive today descends from a founding population that was probably no larger than a few thousand individuals. Some estimates go as low as a few hundred who crossed into the Arabian Peninsula and spread across the rest of the world. These people moved into environments they had never encountered before. Cold European winters, arid Central Asian steppes, dense Southeast Asian jungles, the frozen plains of Siberia, which humans crossed to eventually reach the Americas. They survived all of it. And while they had many advantages, fire, language, social structure, tools, clothing was arguably the most critical physical technology they carried with them. Without sophisticated clothing, the migration into cold climates would have been biologically impossible. The human body, evolved in Africa, is not built for northern winters. We don't have thick fur. We don't have dense subcutaneous fat like a polar bear. We have clothing. And more than that, we had the cognitive capacity to improve that clothing over time, to observe what worked, teach it to others, and innovate. That capacity, that feedback loop between problem and solution, is what separated Homo sapiens from every other hominin species that came before. Neanderthals used basic animal skins. They had been doing so for hundreds of thousands of years, but the evidence suggests they never developed the kind of tailored, fitted, layered clothing that modern humans eventually created. They didn't innovate their clothing systems the way we did, and eventually they disappeared. We didn't. There's one final piece of this story that I think is the most quietly profound. At some point in human history, researchers debate exactly when, but somewhere between 40,000 and 10,000 years ago, clothing stopped being primarily about survival and became primarily about identity. We know this because the archaeological record shows an explosion in textile complexity, dyeing techniques, decorative elements, and regional variation in clothing styles. Different groups started dressing differently from each other, not because their climates were different, but because they wanted to look different, because looking different meant something. It meant, I am from this group, not that one. I hold this rank, not that one. I follow this set of beliefs. I am available or unavailable. I am mourning or celebrating. I am powerful or I am seeking power. Every function that clothing serves in human society today, social signaling, status display, group identity, personal expression, was already fully operational tens of thousands of years ago, worn by people who had never seen a city, never used money, and had no concept of fashion weeks or dress codes. The instinct is that old, that deep, that fundamentally human. So tonight, when you get dressed tomorrow morning and you will, without thinking, maybe pause for just 1 second. You are participating in a 170,000-year-old human tradition, one that started not with vanity or modesty, but with survival, and then almost immediately became about something more complicated and more interesting than survival. It became about telling the world who you are. That's what clothing has always been. Not a covering, a language. And every morning, whether you realize it or not, you're speaking it.